I've entitled the talk tonight, A Great Leader Dies, a New Symbol is Born. In the last paragraph of October's presentation, I said that in November, today, we will cover the laying of the Cornerstone, the death of Grand Commander Richardson, and the completion of the structure that we proudly point to as the House of the Temple. This is my goal for tonight. As a quick review, we ended the biennial Supreme Council session of 1909, authorizing the enlargement of the current House of the Temple or the erection of a new one, and this was to be carried out by Grand Commander Richardson. If you'll recall, we mentioned that Richardson had taken this mandate to heart, and instead of setting up a myriad of committees to launch this tremendous project, he undertook the whole thing himself as a one-man show. Without further consultation with anyone, he determined to erect a new structure rather than remodel and enlarge the old one. In his eyes, the organization was rapidly growing and needed a new image in the form of an architectural masterpiece for its headquarters. Let's now see how this happened. The plans for the construction of a new House of the Temple were, of course, a reflection of the growth of the membership and the revenue of the Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction. Let's review this phenomenal membership growth. When Pike died in 1891, membership had escalated to 4,000. If you'll recall, we've mentioned in the past that for like 60 plus years, our membership nationwide kind of ranged in the 500 numbers, very small for a nationwide organization. Then in the 1880s, we started picking it up. And during the 1880s, we had an increase of quite a few. And so by the time 1891 rolled around, we had escalated up to 4,000 members. And you will recall that Pike was concerned with 4,000 members, that he was concerned that we were exchanging quality of men for numbers. Well, this is a quick look of the membership totals for the next 20 years. 1901, which was 10 years after Pike died, we had 4,000, 1891. 10 years later, we had 10,000 members. Of course, this is nationwide I'm talking about. And then 5 years later, we doubled that. We had 20,000 members. 2 years later, 1907, we were up to 31,000. And then 1910, which is the time frame we're talking about right now, we were up to 40,000 members. 40,000 from 4,000. And then what's amazing is that in this same time frame that we're talking about in 1911, just one more year later, we had moved up to 55,000. So this was the situation what the Supreme Council was looking at, and it created this idea of complete prosperity. Everything was lovely, and obviously everything was on an upward spiral. In January 1910, Grand Commander Richardson began his search for architects and architectural design. He assembled a list of 8 of the top architects in the country and asked them to submit sketches, designs, and drawings. His one single requirement: they need to be in the style of classical historical buildings. They were all rejected, including one that was submitted in the likeness of the Taj Mahal. Finally, the owner of the Washington Post newspaper and a Scottish Rite Mason referred Richardson to a 36-year-old architect from New York named John Russell Pope. Pope submitted a design based on the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, and this is the one that we passed out here a minute ago. It was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This one clicked with Richardson, and on April 16, 1910, he signed a contract with Pope to draw the plans and superintend the construction. The first problem appeared immediately. The architect advised the Grand Commander that the lot that had been purchased was too small for the building that had been designed. So another lot was found on 16th Street and S Street, 16th and S Streets, and it was purchased. And it was purchased for $164,333.85. Now, folks, that was a lot of money for a lot in any place, using what we consider 1910 dollars. So this was all done by Grand Commander Richardson. Now, he may have talked individually with some members of the Supreme Council, but basically he didn't call a meeting every time there was some decision to be made. The next step was to ask 8 of the very best construction companies in the United States to submit bids. Norcross Brothers of Massachusetts was the low bidder for $837,000. Now, this was for the building only, basically kind of the shell building, no interior work or decorations. After Richardson had done all this pre-construction work himself, he then submitted the whole project to the Supreme Council, the selection of the architect, the selection of the design, and the construction contract for approval. In May of 1910, the Supreme Council promptly approved everything. Construction began, and during the next year, October of 1911, during the biennial session of the Supreme Council, the laying of the Cornerstone was performed by the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia. Other important issues that were addressed during this 1911 session: John H. Coles was elected Secretary General against the wishes of Grand Commander Richardson, who had already appointed Sterling Kerr, a gentleman by the name of Sterling Kerr, and he was performing the duties, but he hadn't been approved by the Supreme Council. So when the next biennial session came along, he was submitted for approval, and the Supreme Council turned him down. Richard's selection was not approved because he was not a member of the Supreme Council himself, and that was mandated for the future. All officers must be members of the Supreme Council. Now, this set up an adversarial relationship between the Grand Commander and the new Secretary General Coles. I mention this because most historians list the 3 greatest Grand Commanders of all time as Albert Pike, Richardson, and Coles. Coles was elected in 1921 as Grand Commander and served until 1952. So as you'll recall, we're in the 1910-11 time frame now. So but 10 years later, so to speak, he was later elected to Grand Commander and served till 1952. So Richardson and Coles were never friends. Also in 1911, an announcement was made of another great gift of 1,000 volumes on art and architecture had been received from a gentleman by the name of Daniel M. Haley from Oklahoma. I have read elsewhere, this wasn't in the Fox book, but I've read elsewhere and know that about this same time, the largest gift ever received by the Supreme Council Library, which is in the area of 8,000 volumes, was donated by William Busby of Oklahoma. Both of them Scottish Rite Masons right here from our own valley. I have read elsewhere that about this same time, at the same time, Oklahoma had only been a state for 4 years, and most of the country looked upon Oklahoma as a collection of Indians, outlaws, and cowboys. So it's ironic that 2 of the important additions to the library came from this supposedly backward state. The last item of business when the Supreme Council considered during the final day of the 1911 session was the appointment of an executive committee of 5 to have full charge of all of the rest of the details involving the completion of the construction and selection of the furnishings for the House of the Temple. Grand Commander Richardson was made an ex officio member of this committee. The committee was selected after all of the basic planning had already been done, obviously, by Richardson. Now this, I don't know the answer to this. This makes me, prompts the question of why was the executive committee appointed? Was it because Richardson was getting tired, all of this work was on him, and so he decided, I need to have some help? Or was it the other way around? Was it because the committee was saying, hey, you're kind of going, you're spending a lot of money here. We need to have some controls on this. So I can't answer that, and that'd be a great question to know later on. While construction of the House of the Temple was continuing, a special session of the Supreme Council was called now in 1912. Richardson appointed George F. Moore, the editor of the New Age magazine, as the Lieutenant Grand Commander to replace Samuel Adams, who died. That was the main reason for the special session. And then also, while they were in special session, well, before I get to that, let me mention this just as a side. This action bypassed Secretary General Coles as the Lieutenant Grand Commander. Obviously, they didn't get along. So this action, let's see, as a reminder, last month I mentioned that the New Age was the forerunner of our current Scottish Rite Journal. It was considered by one of Richardson's great accomplishments. This special, that's the new Lieutenant Grand Commander was the editor of this of the New Age magazine. So this special session that was called also received the first report from the Executive Committee, giving estimates as follows. $325,000 to do the building's interior, $75,000 for furnishings, and $17,000 for architect's fee. A third action seemed inconsequential at the time. A committee of 5 was appointed to develop a plan for the establishment of a permanent fund for fraternal assistance, similar to what Albert Pike had proposed many years previous, but nothing had ever been done in that regard. This is my words, this was the acorn that blossomed into the huge oak tree of fraternity charities in years to come. As construction continued, other important business took place in the biennial session of 1913, which proved to be Richardson's last. Richardson proposed that all Scottish Rite temples of the future should have well-equipped stages with all of the necessary electrical equipment and accessories. What a change, what a change. Thus, the theater style of degree presentation was mandated. Efforts were begun to standardize all degrees, as some had changed wordage and so forth to already more effectively utilize the theater presentation, and a few had not. So he started the standardization for that. This was a good example of grassroots action and practices which later prompted executive action. This theater deal, as you'll recall from previous talks, was started down at the grassroots. Albert Pike never approved it, and until 1891, when he died, the Southern jurisdiction did not have any theater presentations, or at least he didn't know about them. And so thereafter, it gradually came into being, but it wasn't until 1913 when actually the Supreme Council took this action.
And you said it came into being in order to process all this huge growth that was happening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And of course, one of the reasons is that in the lodge room setting, you have one candidate at a time, just like in the Blue Lodge. Whereas, and we were having all these numbers, and they just wouldn't work. And so the theater style of degree presentation was we could have it on the stage and have a number of candidates looking at the same time. So yeah, this was part of it. At least Richardson should be given credit for recognizing this fact and finally taking action. As mentioned before, the Supreme Council of the Southern jurisdiction since the death of Pike had taken the approach, if you want to do that, we will look the other way, to actually legislating that the theater would be the way. Another 1913 milestone was the announcement of the possibility of receiving another collection of books by and about Robert Burns, the 18th century Scottish poet and unofficial poet laureate of the Scottish Rite. Burns' phrase, "the mystic tie," has become an apt description of Masonry down through the years. Finally, this collection actually came into the possession of the Scottish Rite Library 5 years later in 1918. I've done a talk on Robert Burns, and I will mention this again at the end of this talk. Another significant action was the adoption of an amendment to the statutes requiring a 2/3 majority vote to elect a Grand Commander. All other officials of the Supreme Council would still only require a simple majority. The Council understandably wanted a new Grand Commander to have a substantial approval rating. This provision for a supermajority is still in effect today. The next year, Grand Commander Richardson died at his home in Murfreesboro, Tennessee on July the 24th, 1914, just a few days before World War I broke out. The tall sycamore, as he was called, had been in poor health starting back about 1910. He had been credited with three major accomplishments during his tenure as Grand Commander: the founding of the New Age publication, the uniform dramatization of degrees with cast, stage, and scenery, and then, of course, the construction of the House of the Temple, which, by the way, was not completed at the time of his death. And me personally, I would add to the above his ability to relate to the D.C. and congressional establishment due to his being a member of the Congress for his first few years. It broke a lot of ice, and it gave the Scottish Rite an opportunity to do things like putting up the statue of Pike. That would never have happened if Richardson hadn't been there to grease the wheels to take place. Okay. As has been stated before, he is considered on the same lofty plane as Pike, Cole, and John Coles, each of whom served for 31 years. Richardson's accomplishments were done in 13. Upon Richardson's death, Lieutenant Grand Commander George F. Moore was temporarily elevated to the position of Grand Commander in October 1914 and then confirmed in the biennial session of 1915. Moore was born in Alabama, studied law at the University of Virginia, and then returned to Alabama to practice. He had served on the Supreme Council for 26 years prior to becoming Grand Commander. As mentioned, he was the founding editor of the New Age and was a prolific writer in the field of Masonry. The biennial of 1915 was indeed a historic event. The first order of business was the dedication of the new, beautiful House of the Temple. The dedication took place exactly to the day, October the 18th, 4 years after the laying of the Cornerstone in 1911. An impressive ceremony took place at the front entrance. The crowd, located on the concrete terrace, separated from the speakers by the symbolic 3, 5, 7, and 9 steps ascending in flights to the third floor front entrance where the speakers were located. The building is of classic Greek-Egyptian architectural style, incorporating Masonic symbolism. How many have visited the House of the Temple firsthand? Okay, well, we have some. Those people recognize that it's 100 years old now, almost, but it is a beautiful structure. There is a colonnade. Let me give you some descriptions of this. Now, you can look at these things if you want to while we're talking about it. There is a colonnade of 33 fluted ionic columns, each 33 feet in height, surmounted by an Egyptian-inspired pyramidical staggered roof. That means the roof looks like a pyramid. The structure, as mentioned, is of Greek and Egyptian architectural style and is patterned after a building which was built by the Romans. So here we've got three cultures involved in the building of this. We have the Roman culture, the Egyptian culture, and the Roman culture, because they're the ones that actually constructed the building that we used as a pattern. And of course, this is the one we're talking about. The first floor is partially, let's see, first of all, the building contains 88,000 square feet located on 4 levels. The basement includes the boiler room and storage space, some of which has now been converted into offices. The first floor is partially below grade. It provides for a banquet hall which seats 400 and also the kitchen which accommodates the banquet hall. The front entrance is on the 3rd floor and leads into the beautiful tall atrium. On the north side of the atrium are the offices and former living quarters of the Grand Commander. On the south side is the Secretary General's office, now changed to the office of the Executive Director. Also on this floor are the elaborate executive chamber where the Supreme Council would meet when in closed session, and finally, the library. The 4th floor houses the majestic temple room, where the ceiling is 105 feet from the altar in the center of the room to the pyramid-type style roof. The architectural experts have stated that this building is one of the most vital structures erected in modern times, and they have labeled it a masterpiece. The Scottish Rite, with explosive growth and membership and the completion of the House of the Temple, is now in a position to begin a new journey, which will include the recognition of the need to reach out to the world. This upcoming era could be called From Ritual to Service. This is another story for another time. Thank you.